In this talk, my colleague Lillian, Grace and I will offer a policy agenda to help New Zealand to prepare for long-term global environmental change. I will begin by explaining why the environment has become so much more important to us. Lillian will then describe three important global environmental trends that will affect our future: climate change, resource scarcities, and ecosystem decline. I will return to cover four important obstacles that are slowing the global and the local response to environmental trends. Then Lillian will introduce our proposed policy development agenda that will help prepare New Zealand to take advantage of the opportunities that are created and also to protect against the important risks from long-term environmental change. New Zealand is already doing a lot. It is participating in international and domestic research and policy development to reduce emissions and thereby reduce climate change risk. It is also engaged in a lot of activity, both policy and action, to protect New Zealand's environmental assets, both from domestic threats that already exist, as well as from biosecurity risks. And more recently, New Zealand has been developing plans to help New Zealand companies to take advantage of the opportunities that are created by green growth. The environment has become much more important to New Zealanders. A recent poll prior to the last election indicated that 19% of New Zealanders polled thought that the environment was the most important issue, and that's up from 7% a year previously. Businesses, governments, NGOs and individuals are changing their activities and their behaviour in order to take advantage of environmental change, but also to protect our future. The question is, what are the long-term risks? Are we doing enough to prepare to take advantage of the opportunities and to protect ourselves against the risks? Let's start with where we are today and how we got here. If you want to navigate the future, it's important to be able to explain the past using the same framework as you're going to use to explain the future. So where we are today is that the world's population has just passed 7 billion people. And if we look back, we can see a more or less continuous process of development, starting with fire and stone tools, moving through bronze and iron and steel, through computers to genetic engineering and nanotechnology. And we tend to think of progress as having been continuous. But if you look a little closer, you see quite a different picture. The population data in the figure shows the global population estimated from around the year 1000 to today. And what you can see is that there was initially a period of relatively slow growth, followed by another period of relatively rapid growth. And it turns out that development hasn't been the continuous path that we might have expected it to be, but rather is quite discontinuous. And by understanding the nature of that discontinuity, you can get some insight into what's driving change in the past and what might affect change in the future. So we go back right to the beginning. For millions of years, our hominid ancestors lived by hunting and gathering what was available. And their population densities were very low because what they were drawing from was grasslands and forests, and the productivity of those grasslands and forests was quite low, and therefore the total human population was quite low. But the invention of agriculture about 10,000 years ago changed everything. By staying in one place and farming land, our ancestors were able to secure a lot more production from the same amount of land, and so populations grew very rapidly. So what drove that advance was the development of a new technology, agriculture, that made the physical environment a lot more productive than it had been. In effect, the environment got much larger, and the population who could earn a living from a square kilometre of land grew dramatically. Agriculture spread to the land where it was suitable, and cities were formed along with advanced civilizations that used writing and mathematics. Once the transition to agriculture was complete, though, the population again grew only slowly. The reason for the slow growth was that in any particular location, the population was constrained by the land available and the agricultural technology available to exploit it. One man with his horses or oxen could only get a modest amount of food from his unit of land. During the agricultural era, high birth rates meant that populations would grow rapidly, and then every generation or so there would be some combination of famine or war or disease that would come along to reduce the population back to the sustainable level. Then around 1800, another major change happened. Population had grown to the point where the demand for wood, for fuel, for construction and for shipping had begun to outstrip the supply, and so coal began to be used as an alternative energy source. The exploitation of fossil fuels combined with new agricultural technology meant a huge increase in the amount of food that could be produced from one unit of land, and therefore to the sustainable population density. In effect, the combination of energy and agricultural innovation increased the food production potential so much that environmental productivity ceased to be a practical constraint on population. Non-agricultural technology, innovation and trade increased the environment productivity further and allowed establishment of the modern industrial civilization across the whole earth. Modern economics emerged during this period when environmental constraints were economically irrelevant. In modern conventional economics, production involves using technologies to combine capital and labour to produce output. The environment is ignored because it is not a constraint. The relevant assumption is called the free gifts and free disposals assumption, and essentially it says that you can take resources from the environment and dispose of wastes into the environment without limit. And that all worked really well for almost 200 years. And then the economy got so large that the pressures on the environment increased again. Ecological footprint analysis is used to estimate the amount of land that would be required to sustainably provide for the consumption needs of today's population at the current standard of living. The analysis shows that consumption passed through a requirement of 1 Earth around 1980, and now about 1.5 Earths are required to support the population. Total output increased by around 60 times between 1800 and 2000. And if the population grows as projected, then there will be 9.5 billion people approximately on the Earth in 2050. And if GDP per capita grows as it has been growing over the last 30 years, so we project GDP per capita growth forward, multiply that by the expected population, what we can see is that the total output of the Earth will increase by around 4 times between 2000 and 2050, as shown in the figure. So the ecological footprint will grow too, and the estimation is that around 2 Earths will be required to support the population that is expected in 2050. So that means that either we're going to continue to borrow from the future, or we'll have to reduce the ecological footprint per capita by around about half of what it is today in order to live in a sustainable way by 2050. That's going to be difficult given the aspirations of the large populations in the developing countries to increase their consumption levels. So expansion of the size of the global economy beyond sustainability is creating important stresses and risks.
3 of the most important constraints we face are climate change, resource scarcities, and ecosystems decline. So I'll start by talking about these issues with a global view, and then we'll come back and discuss the implications they have for New Zealand's national strategy. It's now widely agreed that humans are changing the Earth's climate. Globally, the temperature has increased by about 0.8 degrees Celsius in the last 100 years, and most of that change has just been in the past few decades. In addition to that change that has already been measured, it's expected that the temperature will rise by a further about 0.6 degrees as oceans and ice sheets continue to adjust to greenhouse gases that have already been emitted. So that will take us to about 1.4 degrees Celsius higher than the temperature was in 1900. And that is no minor adjustment. To put it in perspective, the difference between the Earth's temperature in an ice age and today is just 4 degrees. Climate change is already harming some people, and if the Earth's temperature increases by more than 2 degrees, there will be great harm to many people. And there'll also be the risk of triggering positive feedback effects, which will lead to more warming and possibly to abrupt climate change. The Earth's climate does not usually change smoothly and gradually, but large changes can occur over just a few decades and possibly even faster. More climate change will increase the severity and frequency of storms, fires, floods, and the sea level will rise as ice melts, which will affect agricultural production, especially in developing countries. In 2007 and 8, leading scientists and climate policymakers agreed to set a target to try and avoid 2 degrees of warming. And that 2-degree target implies that we need to reduce emissions by about 25 to 40% relative to 1990 levels in developed countries by 2020. And that we need to reduce emissions by 80% by 2050. And despite a lot of effort to change, there is no evidence in the reduction of emissions. As shown in this figure, the carbon dioxide composition in the atmosphere continues to increase. With global output expected to increase about 4-fold between 2000 and 2050, there will also be a large increase in the requirements of resources like energy, food and land, fresh water and materials. As economies become richer, the materials intensity per dollar of output tends to decrease, but most of the increase in output growth that is expected in the next 40 years will come from developing countries who are industrialising and who require infrastructure and a lot of resources to establish themselves. Many of our resources are already being used at a rate faster than they are being replaced, so our current behaviour is not sustainable. Energy plays a really core part to our use of resources because it is used for their extraction, processing and distribution. And under current policies, our energy demand is expected to increase by 50% in the next 25 years. Supply of conventional oil is becoming constrained. Output from most of the biggest oil fields has already peaked, and there are fewer big oil wells being discovered. This figure shows the oil price trend from 1960 to the present. You can see prices increased in the 2 oil shocks of the 1970s as OPEC exploited supply control to grow revenue. But the price increase since 1998 has been much larger. With energy embedded in most of what we use, when the price of energy goes up, the price of everything else does too. And with current behaviour, 80% of the increased energy demand is projected to be met with fossil fuel use. That expectation is completely incompatible with the climate-driven need for a large reduction in fossil fuel emissions. Food equals population, and increased access to food allows a population to grow. In the recent past, increases in food output have been achieved by increasing yields. The rapid population growth seen in the 1960s created food shortages and triggered research into improving food productivity. The result was known as the Green Revolution, and food productivity was improved dramatically through the use of things like hybrid cereals, fertilisers, herbicides and pesticides, so the shortages were relieved. But now, again, people are becoming concerned once more about food shortages and security. Although the proportion of the population who are hungry have declined, the overall number of hungry people has increased. And after a long period of food price decline, food prices have been generally rising since the early 2000s, as shown in this figure. The price rises are exacerbated by rising energy costs, as energy is such an important input to food production and distribution. And food price increases lead to conflict. Protests about increases in food prices have contributed to the current civil unrest seen in North Africa and the Middle East. Reporting has labelled the removal of dictatorial governments as Arab Spring, but one of the really important underlying problems is the increase in real prices for essentials, and that will not be solved by regime change. Most of the land that can be used for agriculture is already being used for agriculture, or it is covered in forests, which are really important to retain due to their role in storing carbon dioxide. So the main opportunities that we have for addressing the food shortage issues are to increase average yields as much as possible, but also to reduce waste. Currently about 40% of harvested food is wasted. In developing nations, that tends to be due to transport and storage conditions, whereas in developed countries it's more at the retail and consumer end. Fresh water is another important developing scarcity, but the issue is more of a local one rather than global. Demand for water is expected to increase by about 60% in the 25 years to 2030, but already about 1/3 of the world's population are exposed to water scarcity. So that is expected to rise to more than half the population by 2050 with current behaviour. Water scarcity leads to problems in food production, human health and economic development, and it can also lead to conflict, especially when people upstream are using or want to use water that would otherwise be used downstream. Overall, we have become a lot more efficient at our use of materials. As this figure shows, there has been a long period of materials price reductions as we develop technologies for better extraction and processing. But the price trend has recently reversed, and the real prices for materials and minerals have almost tripled since 2000. Although absolute scarcity is not the issue yet, many materials are becoming more difficult to access and more expensive to extract. Some are deeper and less well located, or of a lower grade, meaning that they require more energy for processing. And energy is embedded throughout the processing of our materials, so rising prices of energy are exacerbating the rising prices of materials. Ongoing extraction of a finite resource must eventually lead to scarcities. Initially, the emergence of scarcities is signalled by price rises as marginal supply costs increase. Price rises are followed by contention for supply and crowding out as the scarcities become more severe. Prices are high during booms and they tend to fall during recessions, but prices remain high now and the global economy is no longer booming. We don't know what's going to happen next, but we need to consider the possibility that the price increases may not be temporary, and what the implications are for New Zealand and around the globe. There is evidence of unprecedented global environmental change, as human activity has been directed towards meeting the increased demand for energy, food, fresh water and materials. The activities have helped improve the lives of billions of people, but some impacts have weakened the ability of the environment to provide some services. Healthy ecosystems and biodiversity underpin human survival and well-being. Ecosystems are a dynamic complex of animal, plant, human and microorganism communities interacting with one another and their non-living environment. Ecosystem services are the benefits people obtain from their membership in the functioning ecosystems, such as the air quality, pollination, food, fresh water and climate regulation. The value of the global environmental services provided to people from nature were estimated at $180 trillion in 2000, and that was 4.5 times the gross world product. But 2/3 of the services provided to humans by nature are in decline. Some examples are the declines that we see in fisheries, in our air and water quality, the increases in soil degradation, and some of the extinction and over-harvesting of medicinal resources.
So scientists and activists have been warning us for some time about the environmental trends that Lillian's talked about, but so far we haven't seemed to have done enough in terms of taking action to even slow down those trends, let alone reverse them. The question then becomes, well, why is that? Because if you look at examples like the Montreal Protocol, which was put in place to deal with the hole in the ozone layer, that was quite successful. Similarly, we have managed to develop agricultural technologies to address the famines that took place in the 1960s and 1970s and triggered the Green Revolution. So why with these issues that we're facing now, these aggregate global issues, why is it that we're not getting as positive a response as we got to those kinds of issues? And the reason is that there are certain characteristics of the environmental problem that we face in the aggregate that means there are important obstacles to an effective and successful response. The first of those was covered in part in the first part of this talk when we illustrated the paradigms that are being used by people to think about the present and the future, and implicitly the past as well. We have one quite dominant paradigm, the economic paradigm, which is really based on an understanding of the transition, the growth period when the environment wasn't a very important constraint. And in that period we developed an economics that was based on technology and capital and labour, and to some extent policies to protect environmental assets at the margin when issues arose, usually specific local issues. But when you think about the kinds of aggregate issues that we face with the overshoot, the ecological footprint, which essentially says, look, we're using more of the Earth's resources than can be sustained, and we are in fact borrowing from the future. You realise that an economic model, a paradigm that's based on excluding environment as a consideration, isn't going to be adequate for thinking about the future. So what we have is a conflict between two views in the world. One view based on a conventional economic paradigm which looks back and says we've had progress, we will continue to have progress, and another view based on a more ecological view that says, look, what we're facing is an overshoot crisis. In fact, if we keep on growing the economy without thinking about what the environmental consequences of that will be in a way that allows us to manage those consequences, then the result will be we will run out of environmental resource and the economy will either quickly or slowly collapse. So there's an undeclared conflict going on in the world between these two views of the world, in effect two paradigms. And the consequence of this undeclared conflict, and the fact that it's not especially strongly recognised, is that when people come to debate environmental issues, they tend to talk past one another, because they often have quite different paradigms, and therefore that leads to different sets of assumptions. But in the long term, those two have to go together. I mean, you can't have a good economy without a good environment. You can't have a good environment without a good economy in the short term. Sorry, in the long term. But in the short term, there are some important issues to be managed, and that means we've got to work together to manage those issues. So the first issue is the paradigm problem. The second issue could be called the collective action problem, because it highlights that we need to work together. Each of us may recognise that there are emerging and important environmental issues, and that if we were to change our behaviour, well, that would be good. But it would only be good if everyone else changed their behaviour as well. If I change my behaviour and no one else changes their behaviour, then I may be making some kind of an economic or other sacrifice, but the result will be no real change so long as everybody else continues to behave in the same way as they previously have. So that creates a question about coordination. How is it that we're going to find a way to work together? And it's not just at an individual level, it occurs also at a business level and at a country level. At a country level, you know, we see it reflected in the climate change debate, where everyone kind of says, well, it would be a good idea if there was change. We all agree with that, but it would be much better if someone else paid the cost of that change rather than my country. And you know, if I have a choice, maybe it would be better to do it later rather than earlier, because you know, it's difficult for me to take that kind of a proposal back to my constituency. So that creates what's called the free rider problem, where people have an incentive to free ride on the actions of others. And then that, because we've got this free rider or collective action problem, the question is, how do we ensure the coordination to get the collective action, to get the aggregate amount of change, so everybody feels, well, I'm doing my part, but I'm doing my part alongside others who are also doing their part. So when you get these kinds of issues, what you normally do is you look to governments and to businesses in order to create conditions whereby everyone can effectively work together in one way or another. But in the aggregate, we're not getting enough action, so there must be some option, some obstacle, perhaps at the government level, perhaps at the business level, that is leading to a slower rate of change than might be needed to address the environmental issues. So let's start with businesses. I mean, first of all, there are many businesses that are playing very important roles in leading change. Businesses, business leaders are doing a lot. And often they're doing a lot because they've found an opportunity where they can take action and you get an environmental benefit and they also get a business benefit. That's a win-win kind of situation. And it's great to see those businesses doing that. It gets a bit more difficult for businesses when it's not a win-win situation. When to achieve a better environmental outcome, there's an economic cost for that business. And that becomes difficult for a couple of reasons. The first reason is that businesses are in effect governed by their directors. And directors, certainly in New Zealand and in some other economies, have an obligation, a legal obligation, to act in the interests of the company. So if there's something that might well be good for the environment, but it harms the company, the business leader is not actually legally able to do it. The second thing that slows the responses for some businesses that would incur costs is that any environmental benefit that might result might be a long way away, and the costs may be incurred now. And even if the business gets an economic benefit as a result of a better environmental outcome some 10 or 20 or 30 years down the track, the discount rates that businesses use mean that benefits for businesses that come more than, say, 10 or 15 years out don't figure very well or very strongly in the calculations that people make about what they should do today. So businesses whose activities damage the environment or who would have to pay to get better environmental outcomes actually have a pretty strong incentive to resist those kinds of changes. Now, when that occurs, the normal response is, well, we obviously need governments to be able to regulate these things so that businesses behave in the way that is beneficial for the environment. And businesses are fine with that normally, provided the regulations are fair and predictable and they affect them just as much as they affect their competitors. They understand the need for these kind of regulations, but they are very concerned if they see that these regulations disadvantage them. And when governments act, often the businesses that are affected are in international competition. So there's a lot of sensitivity around this. And so businesses will lobby governments pretty effectively sometimes in their own interests. So governments face a difficult challenge in a way, because not only do they face obstacles from businesses to making the kinds of changes that they might want to make, but they also often face obstacles from individuals. So if individuals value economic growth as measured by GDP, even though GDP isn't a great measure of economic performance, and they see that the activities reducing waste, saving resources, moving from big gas guzzling cars to bicycles, those things all have environmental benefits, but they show up as economic costs, not in the sense of a cost that people will pay, but in the sense that the GDP that is the basis upon which economic growth is measured may well not go up as much as it would otherwise go up, or it may go down, and that leads then to governments being voted out. And so governments need to follow what individuals want. And it's that need to follow, because they need to get re-elected every 3 to 5 years or so. That need to follow means that governments are not free to lead, and they're not free to impose the regulations that might be required to address the environmental issues. And those kind of forces from business and government mean that in aggregate the response to change that's required is not as strong as it might be. And if you then contrast that with the Montreal Protocol, which I mentioned before, it's a lot easier in that case, because I think there were about 6 major producers of those banned chemicals, and all that was required was a global agreement to stop production of those chemicals from those 6 facilities. A much easier problem than how do we change the activities of billions of people who are consuming things that affect the environment. So it turns out that governments and businesses, both governments and businesses, respond to the leadership of individuals. So when we think that we're going to turn to governments and businesses to lead this change, we're making a mistake, because it's the individuals themselves who are the leaders, and the governments and businesses in respect to this are the followers. So then the question becomes, what do we do to change the behaviour of those individuals in their leadership? And what we need in terms of getting more action from individuals leading businesses and governments is 4 kinds of changes in values and beliefs. First of all, a paradigm change. It would help if individuals understood that the paradigm that's been developed to manage our economy, the capital and labour and technology paradigm, is a paradigm that is most suited to a situation where you don't have environmental constraints. And now we do have environmental constraints, so we need to shift to a different paradigm. Secondly, individuals value consumption a great deal, and they're not very concerned about risk. If they understood some of the trends a little better and some of the implications of those trends, and they were using a different paradigm, then they might become more concerned about risk. And if they became more concerned about risk, they would be more supportive of changes that businesses and governments might make to produce better environmental outcome. The third thing is that we've been taught during the period of rapid economic growth to be self-interested. To be self-interested in terms of short-term consumption. That's what motivates us. That's what we tell businesses we want. That's what we tell governments we want to a degree, and that's the way that we lead them. But if we were to switch in terms of what our demands are of businesses and governments from short-term self-interest to a bit more of the long-term collective interest, then that would change the incentives for those governments and businesses, and would in turn change their behaviour. And finally, most of us have looked at the collective action problem and come to the conclusion that there isn't anything that I can do that's going to make any difference. And in fact, it's a mistake in our opinion. What individuals can do, and it's the most important things that individuals can do, and it's probably the most important thing that can make a difference, is that individuals can influence others. And by influencing others, they can create the critical mass that will lead governments and businesses to make different choices. And if governments and businesses make different choices in what they produce, in what they and how they regulate, then that's what will be required to reverse the adverse environmental trends that Lillian talked about previously. So with such important obstacles to a very strong response to the environmental risks that we face, the question then becomes, well, what's going to be the outcome? And the outcome, of course, depends not only on the response, which we're uncertain about, but it also depends upon the state of the environment. And we know a lot about that, but we don't know what all the possibilities are, and particularly how things might interact with one another, how economic forces might interact with environmental forces, how the energy and climate conundrum might play out. So what I'm going to talk through now is 4 possible scenarios, not to argue that these are the only 4 scenarios, but to illustrate the kinds of outcomes that might be possible and what might make a difference to getting one kind of outcome rather than another kind of outcome. So the first outcome, and it's shown on the figure, is in a way is the business as usual outcome. We saw from what Lillian was saying earlier that the ecosystems are actually in decline by and large. So what that means is if ecosystems are in decline, then we're getting to a point where the sustainable population of the Earth with a particular level of technology is going down. And yet at the same time we've got output being grown very rapidly. So we've got an increasing gap in terms of the ecological footprint. As the ecological footprint goes up, what it reflects is a gap between the resources that we're drawing from the Earth and the Earth's ability to provide those resources. And in effect that means, as I said before, we're borrowing from the future. Now you can borrow from the future, but there's a limit to how far you can go in borrowing from the future. And eventually it becomes unsustainable in the sense that if you've only got a certain amount of resource available from the environment, then the use of that resource has to decline. And so the figure shows that. It illustrates that you reach a point where the gap between what you're drawing from the environment and what the environment can sustainably supply you with becomes so large, and you get an overshoot crisis. You get a collapse, in effect, of output, and that takes the form of a combination of a reduction in population and a reduction in the output per capita or the consumption per capita. Times get tough. The second option is that you may respond by saying we just can't face an overshoot crisis of that kind, so we need to do something to avoid that. And what we will do is we'll slow the rate of resource use growth, and we'll pay a bit more attention to protecting the environmental resources so they can be more productive, And we'll also invest in some technologies that allow us to draw more output from the environment that's available to us. And you can see a world that's shown in the second figure where consumption continues to grow for a while, then the resource use flattens off, output growth might continue, but resource use is contained by increased resource use efficiency and so on, and we protect the environment somewhat, but we've still got a gap between the two. And as long as that gap between the two exists, we're continuing to borrow from the future, and as long as we continue to borrow from the future, eventually we have to pay that back. And that payback just occurs later and maybe a little softer than it did in the original overshoot model that I introduced this section with. The third possibility is that we manage to continue the resource use growth and we increase the environment productivity so that the environment actually is able to provide the resources that we require. That is in effect what people are in a way hoping for. What they're hoping for is that we can continue to grow, maximise GDP as a strategy, and deal with the issues by making the environment more productive. And making the environment more productive usually means relying on some great new technologies that are going to allow us to be able to support 9.5 billion people in 2050 with a very high standard of living. The interesting thing about that, of course, is that if you are going to make that work, you have to work very, very hard to increase the environment productivity. It isn't going to happen by itself. And so that implies a set of actions to achieve that are not yet in place. The fourth possibility is an unfortunate one. What we don't know is we've been borrowing from the future for quite a long time. What we don't know is how long we can continue to borrow from the future. And the fourth one says, actually, these resource cost increases, the data we showed on prices for important resources, the damage that's accruing in the ecosystems and so on, that means that the environment is actually starting to get quite exhausted. And so the productivity of the environment is going to start going down at a faster rate perhaps than it has been, and the gap can't be sustained, and so we quite quickly get a reduction in output. So the difference between this model and the first model is that in this model the overshoot crisis actually comes much more quickly because the environment starts to struggle under the load we're putting it on. Whereas in the first model, the environment, the gap between the environment's ability to supply resource and the demand for it can stay a big gap for a longer time before a crisis occurs. So there are just four possible scenarios for the future, and we may each have beliefs about which of those is going to occur, but the important thing about all four of those scenarios is that in the end, the two lines that are shown, the resource use and the sustainable supply of resource, have to match up again. And at the moment there's a long gap between the two of them, and we don't really have agreed plans for how we're going to close that gap. We need those plans.
The data I went through earlier indicates the future is unlikely to be an extension of the past, as the world's economy is becoming very large in relation to the environment that supports it. The issues raised are long-term, with high stakes and high uncertainty. National strategies must ensure environmental conditions can support economic activity. It is important we think through what may happen during the next few decades and have a plan that positions New Zealand well for all eventualities. New Zealand is relatively well positioned to respond effectively to the direct effects of environmental changes. There are numerous renewable energy sources, abundant food, land, water and materials. But globalisation means New Zealand will have to respond to the consequences of environmental constraints in other countries. Increasing our planning effort is important so that we have a strategy suited to New Zealand's unique circumstances that realises opportunities and reduces risks. It will help guide businesses and individual behaviour day to day and help more people understand environmental issues, so they will support risk reduction changes when they are required. There is a lot of uncertainty, so in response, the strategic work should be done in three parts. Improve New Zealand's capability to adapt to different futures, develop no-regret strategies that realise benefits or have only low costs if changes do not occur as anticipated, and develop mini-max strategies that protect against catastrophes by minimising the maximum loss. We have developed a proposed agenda with 16 items that can be used to develop an environmentally informed strategy for New Zealand. I will introduce all of them now, but the more detailed development of each will be available offline. There are 5 items for building capability. First, a futures-focused institution. The future is very uncertain, and New Zealand has few institutions that explicitly aim to anticipate, understand and manage long-term risks. There is no Futures Institute within government, or that is a locus for central government thinking about how to develop and manage environmentally informed long-term strategies, which makes New Zealand unusual among developed countries. New Zealand should develop stronger institutional capability to study the long-term future, to identify tools for managing it, and to lead debates about future issues. The capability should be for the whole of government, as environmental, economic and social issues are all connected, especially in the long term. Secondly is ANR. Government encourages and assists organisations to lift innovation and management capability. It should also encourage increased capability to manage environmental change. 4 capabilities that would be helpful for organisations are acuity, understanding likely and possible futures. Second, navigation, working out what to do to manage opportunities and risks. Third, agility, being able to change effectively when required. And fourthly, resistance, being able to respond well when events or shocks occur. The third item is metrics. What gets measured gets managed, and currently GDP is the most widely used societal performance measure. But it is a crude measure that counts waste, crime and hospital stays as benefits. Efforts should be made to improve metrics that encourage beneficial economic activity and reduce damaging activity. For example, GDP could be supplemented with measures that encourage growing the profit earned by exports, or encourage lower costs for the delivery of goods and services that the population value. There could be measures that value reductions in ecological footprints, or the growth of environmental assets. Next we have institutions. In the short term, there are some important trade-offs between economic and environmental outcomes that present difficult choices. A common way to resolve the issues is to have 2 sides define preferred solutions and provide evidence. Then they lobby the referee or go to court to try and get their solutions adopted. A better approach is to bring parties together in dialogue and to develop and explore the options that best address conflicting objectives. Creative breakthroughs, compromises and least cost solutions are more likely when parties are working together. So institutional arrangements should ensure there is analysis that examines how trade-offs could best be managed, not a conflict that requires choosing between divergent proposed solutions. Denmark has a different institutional arrangement than in New Zealand, for example. There is a Ministry of Climate, Energy and Building that is responsible for efforts to prevent climate change, but is also responsible for energy policies. And next, public understanding. If the public has a sound understanding of the situation and risks of environmental issues, there is a much better chance that people will respond positively when change is needed, and that they will support government when they come up with sound policies. As public understanding is so important, environmental reports and predictions could be provided to lift environmental literacy throughout New Zealand and be combined with regular assessment to assess understanding. So the next area for strategy is the no regrets, i.e. directions of development that will be beneficial despite uncertainty. The first of these is high-value resource-based exports. Emerging global scarcities of food and other commodities are driving up prices for New Zealand's commodity exports. But Although another doubling of real food prices would increase export earnings, it would not be sufficient to allow New Zealand to rejoin the highest income group of countries. Building export businesses that add value to commodities will provide the opportunities to create high-value jobs that are anchored here. The second no-regret strategy is a technologically advanced economy. Developing a workforce that is technologically capable with diverse skills can increase economic prosperity, but it can also help provide options and resilience to respond to future challenges that may not be recognised today. Third is the green economy. A green economy results in improved human well-being and social equity, and reduced environmental risk and ecological scarcities. Greening the economy provides new business opportunities that increase margins and gets better environmental outcomes simultaneously. Efforts are already being made by the New Zealand Government through the Green Growth Advisory Group and by some organisations such as Pure Advantage to encourage and support green growth. The efforts being made will help New Zealand compete more successfully in some industries and also to enter new industries. But if New Zealand businesses are too slow to take the opportunities, they may be taken by others, and New Zealand will lose market share to faster and more innovative competitors. Fourth is resource use efficiency. In the 20th century, when resources were plentiful and cheap, growing materials use was valuable. The analysis of resource scarcities implies the cost of energy and materials input has become more important, so there are now benefits from improving resource use efficiency. Remoteness from markets, having a resource-intensive economy, and high energy costs mean New Zealand can gain more benefits than most countries from improving resource use efficiency. And if New Zealand is an early mover, it might gain advantages from developing valuable technologies. Next is resolving emissions disconnects. New Zealand faces three issues from the likely need for rapid reduction in emissions. They are issues already today, but they have no agreed solutions, and they are complex and connected. 1. Which energy supply sources we should use going forward. 2. Agriculture, which accounts for almost half of New Zealand's greenhouse gas emissions, but is very important to New Zealand's economy and likely to incur emission charges that will be additional costs for farmers. And 3. Transport. New Zealand has a high rate of car ownership, therefore it's exposed to economic risks from high energy prices or environmental constraint. But transport planning documents implicitly assume emissions and energy constraints will not be important. Given climate risks and increasing international concern that something must be done, New Zealand should have plans to allow it to achieve the scale of reductions that would be required by an effective international agreement. The sixth no-regret strategy area is climate change preparedness. Climate modelling indicates New Zealand is relatively less exposed to future climate changes than in many other places. More rainfall is expected in the west and less in the east, which may lead to possible droughts. Storms are expected to increase and sea level to rise. So the response should be to increase the robustness and resilience of our built environment and infrastructure, to protect our coastal ecosystems and to build expectations of sea level rise into our long-term infrastructure planning. The next area is environment protection. Biosecurity, preserving biodiversity and other conservation efforts are well established in New Zealand. So continued protection is important to maintain incomes from land-based industries, including tourism, and to avoid potential complete loss of natural forests. Future efforts could focus on more permanent solutions that do not require such huge ongoing human efforts. Population and migration is the next area. Many countries have populations far too large to cope if environmental constraints force them to become self-sufficient. New Zealand has choices, and it would be unwise to take unnecessary risk. New Zealand needs to anticipate that many people will want to come and live here, and it should develop a view as to how big the population should be and introduce policies to achieve the desired result. Important influences of a population growth strategy include land availability and intensity of use, food for exports versus domestic consumption, the skills that are needed here, and global risks. It looks as if Earth may not cope well with the output growth and that trends would see produced by 2050. Given the circumstances, it would be wise for New Zealand to consider how it could manage the downside risk should an overshoot crisis develop. These are called mini-max strategies. The first is supply chain security. Emerging scarcities are changing international business. For a long time, trade policy has been concerned with overcoming import protectionism. If established trends continue, there will likely be a shift to long-term contracts and vertical integration by customers securing supply. And as a small, isolated trading nation, New Zealand is highly dependent on the rest of the world for supply of important commodities and services. Without tractors, computers, or spare parts for transmission networks, life would become much more difficult. Relationships with important suppliers and trade partners should be managed carefully so New Zealand is a favoured customer. And just as event risk management plans for disasters, there should be plans to prevent and respond to disruption of critical supply chains. Next is self-sufficiency and skills. As supply risk concerns increase, there is increased effort to become more self-sufficient in important areas. Protecting against supply risk implies also identifying the technical and production capabilities that should be available locally, because the consequences for supply disruption would be unacceptable. This is not an argument to return to producing many goods locally, but rather to ensure against specific supply risks that could have serious detrimental consequences. Skills are an important element of preparedness. The skills that would be required in a disrupted society are different from those today. Widespread understanding of basic construction, food production and preservation techniques would improve resilience if difficulties do emerge. And lastly, security and foreign policy. It is possible that climate change, resource scarcities and ecosystems decline will combine to disrupt the economic development progress people expect and rely on. Security may become far more important than is currently expected. The environment adds an important dimension to geopolitical evolution, one that is not fully understood yet. Foreign policy should be influenced by security, migration and other geopolitical implications of climate change. So when it comes to responding and implementing a strategy, a wide range of talent and resources need to be pulled together and combined effectively to get the results that are needed. Businesses, individuals, government, NGOs and activists all need to play their part. So businesses can look for green growth opportunities, ways to use resources more effectively. They can secure their supply chains and align their R&D efforts to support opportunities and decrease risks. They can develop useful communications and their own A&R capabilities. Individuals have a very important role to play. They can become informed about the issues and their importance for their own behaviour and consumption choices. But perhaps most important, individuals can communicate the importance of environmental risks and opportunities to others to help increase public understanding. It is the lack of public understanding that is the root cause of slow responses to accumulating environmental risks. Individuals can also influence the behaviour of others through social norms, because few people will continue behaviour that is disapproved of by respected others. At the highest level, governments, both local and national, can look at the structure of their institutions and make sure sufficient attention is being paid to long-term outcomes, and also that institutional arrangements produce best practice management of economy-environment trade-offs. Economic growth is the #1 priority now, and there are very good reasons to seek high-quality economic growth. But government should also develop a suite of economic metrics that provide a guide for increasing the quality of economic activity, not just the quantity. Adaptation plans and downside contingency plans are needed for climate change, infrastructure, supply chains, self-sufficiency, technology development and skills. Central and local governments and individual government agencies should have their own A&R assurances too. Because governments cannot move too far in advance of public support, they should invest in increasing public understanding. If New Zealand can develop and implement a credible and effective environmentally informed national strategy, it will support promotion of environmental credentials and elements of the national brand. Assisting with marketing for exports and tourism and promotion of New Zealand as a great place to live and work. Organisations and activists have their own widely varying purposes and agendas. Some may have opportunities to encourage or contribute to integrated long-term policy development or action, such as in areas of emissions disconnects, population immigration, supply chain security, self-sufficiency and skills, or environmental protection. They may also be able to contribute to public understanding as an indirect means to influence businesses or policy. And many should develop their own A&R capabilities as part of their risk management efforts.
So we've offered some suggestions for directions for development of policy to be better prepared to take advantage of opportunities that will arise from this change and to protect ourselves from the downside risk. We shouldn't be too complacent that we understand the risk. People have been warning about environmental issues for a long time, just as a few people warned about the financial and economic crisis that we're in the process of going through at the moment. And many people, despite those warnings, were surprised. Individuals were caught out, governments were caught out, businesses were caught out. And we need to recognise that we can be caught out by getting things wrong, and we need to be cognizant of that when we think about how we react to messages like this one and to the messages from others who say, look, worry about some of these environmental issues. So we have an option as individuals or as organisations to sort of wait and see, or we have an option to take action to prepare ourselves now. And as with a number of things, taking action early is often beneficial. So one of the things we could do is develop strategy in 4 kind of phases. First of all, we build a wider understanding of the issues, identify topics. We've suggested a preliminary list, facilitate debate, discussion, analysis around each of those topics, and then try to agree some strategies and some actions that allow us to take advantages of the opportunities and also to reduce the risks. It's really hard to think about a future that could be quite different from the world that we live in today. And if we don't actually imagine the possibility of such a future, then it's hard to be well motivated to take action to avoid that future. It would be a shame to succumb to an environmentally driven crisis because of a collective failure of imagination. So future generations will judge us harshly if we leave them with a degraded and damaged planet. We are going to be responsible for what we pass on to future generations. So it's interesting to watch as more and more people come to understand the importance of the environment. The issue is, are enough people coming to understand it quickly enough? And are we doing enough to protect ourselves from the most important risks? Thank you.